What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build this butcher block style bar height dining table. This is made of solid walnut. These are all strips of walnut that were cut and then glued together. So this is the edge grain, almost like a long grain cutting board, but absolutely gorgeous look. This is air dried walnut, so it's got this really nice contrast between the sapwood and heartwood. And the fact that this is a bar height table allows the person I built this for to really see all of their view, since they're kind of up higher than they would be with a typical dining table. I also built a set of matching benches as well, and I will have plans available for all of these if you're interested, and there will be a link to that in the video description below. So without further ado, let's go and get started with the video.
This project was made up of a lot of repetitive tasks. Starting with rough walnut, I first had to break down my boards into their rough lengths at the miter saw. I made sure to leave all the pieces at least an inch longer than their final length, so that I had enough length to trim them to size later. I picked this walnut up off of Craigslist about a year ago and have been slowly working my way through it, and it's pretty rough, has quite a few knots, lots of sapwood and other defects, but it's air dried and has this beautiful depth of color to it. After breaking down the boards at the miter saw, I jointed one edge on each of the boards and then ripped the boards into 1 5/8 inch wide strips at the bandsaw. And I decided to rip these boards on the bandsaw rather than the table saw for two reasons. First, the thinner kerf of the bandsaw means less wasted wood, and second, these boards tended to have a lot of tension in them, so ripping them on the bandsaw was a lot safer. With a resaw blade installed, the ripping process went fairly quickly, and one thing that really helped was setting up a roller stand in the outfeed area of the bandsaw, since a lot of these boards were pretty long and heavy. After getting all the strips ripped to their rough width, I started passing them through the planer. I decided to just skip plane the boards since they didn't really need to be perfectly flat. As long as I arranged my boards correctly during the glue up, any bowing in the strips would disappear. With both faces of each of the strips cleaned up, I began the process of gluing up the sections of the table. I decided to make each section narrow enough to still fit on my jointer, and this allowed me to flatten each of the sections after the glue dried. Here's an exploded view of the main parts of the table. As you can see, each leg is its own section, and the top is divided into 4 sections, 2 longer sections in the center of the top, and 2 shorter sections on the edges. In addition to the parts for the table, I was also gluing up the sections for the benches, and this resulted in an absolutely ridiculous amount of glue ups happening simultaneously in the shop. I think I spent basically 2 full days getting all the strips planed on both faces and then gluing them into their sections, and used every single clamp I own. After the glue ups were finally finished, I started flattening all the sections on the jointer and planer. First, I flattened one face and one edge on the jointer, and then flattened the opposite face on the planer. While I'm flattening, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Powermatic, the gold standard. I upgraded to the Powermatic PJ882 helical head jointer and 15HH helical head planer recently, and it has been an absolute game changer for my woodworking. The surface finish off of these machines is absolutely amazing, and I know that they'll last me for many, many years to come. To learn more about these machines, check out the link in the video description below. Next, I squared up the final edge on the table saw, and during this step, I made sure the width of the outermost sections of the tabletop matched the width of the legs, since these two pieces will be joined together to form the table. Next, I cut each of the sections to their final length at the miter saw, and having a stop block set up here was critical so that all the sections ended up at the same length. With all the sections at their final size, I could start laying out the joinery for the table. Since I needed the top sections to be spaced exactly so that the legs could be recessed in the top, I decided to use dominoes for alignment. I laid out the placement for the dominoes and then cut the mortises using my Domino XL. And if you want to build this table and don't have a domino, I'd recommend using dowel joinery instead of biscuits, since biscuits don't really give an exact enough fit to work well in this application. Next, I cut mortises into the ends of the outer sections of the top, which is how the legs will be connected to the tabletop. I then cut matching mortises into the legs. With all the joinery cut into the tabletop, I moved on to the glue up, which went pretty uneventfully. Having some kind of alignment method like this, whether that's dominoes or dowels, really reduces the stress during a glue up like this. While the glue dried on the top, I cut the stretchers that connect the legs to each other to length, and then cut mortises into the stretchers as well as the legs. I glued up the stretcher and leg assemblies, but forgot to chamfer the edges before the glue up, and this meant a lot of hand tool work for me later on, so make sure to add any edge profiles before this step. As you can see here, I made sure to do this before assembling the benches, and this made my life a lot easier during that process. With the leg assemblies glued up, it was time for the moment of truth, attaching the legs to the tabletop. This was a pretty stressful moment and proved extra challenging due to the sheer size of the table, but I eventually got all the legs seated and added a few clamps, and it turned out great. After the glue dried, I sanded all the surfaces of the table with 80 grit sandpaper to flatten out any misaligned sections, and then went around and filled any knot holes with wood filler. I absolutely love this Timbermate wood filler. The walnut color matches really well. I'll have a link to it in the video description below. After the wood filler dried, I sanded all the surfaces with 120 grit sandpaper and then started chamfering all the edges on the table. It always amazes me how much of a difference an edge profile like chamfering can make to the overall look of the piece, and I really like how this heavy chamfer kind of lightened up the look of the piece. Next, I needed to work on the center stretcher that connects the legs. This stretcher gives the table a lot more stability and is also a great footrest since this is a bar height table. The stretcher is made up of 2 laminated boards, and after squaring up the stretcher, I chamfered the edges and then cut it to final length with the miter saw. Next, I centered the stretcher on the side stretchers and then clamped it in place. To connect the stretcher, I decided to use through dowel joinery, which is really simple. I just drilled a 3/4 inch hole using a Forstner bit, added glue to the hole, pounded in a 3/4 inch dowel, and then trimmed it flush with a flush trim saw. I really love the way these exposed dowels look, and they're incredibly strong. The final piece that added the table was the aprons, which probably aren't even necessary structurally, but did help to eliminate some of the side-to-side play in the table just because it's so tall. I just attached the aprons with pocket screws and glue and used a scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood to recess the apron evenly. With that, the table was basically done, so let's take a look at the benches for a minute. While they're essentially identical, I did do a few things a little bit differently. First, I decided to use my smoothing plane to speed up the flattening of the top, and this worked really well. One other thing that I forgot to show on the table was extending the chamfers on the legs to meet the underside of the top. The router couldn't reach this area, and a chisel and mallet made quick work of this. To attach the backrest of the bench to the bench seat, I used 2 of these brackets from hairpinlegs.com. I wanted to recess the bracket into the wood so that they were flush with the surface, so I created a little router jig using some scrap plywood. This one jig allowed me to cut the recess for both the long and short sections of the bracket by adding a little stop on the jig when cutting the short section. I started by cutting the shorter recess into the bottom and side of the underside of the bench seat. To cut the recess, I used a template bit on the router and made the cut in 2 passes. After cutting the recess on the edge of the bench, I needed to use a file to round the inside edge so that the inside radius of the bracket would fit nicely. To cut the recess on the backrest, I just removed the stop from the jig and cut along the full length of the jig, and as you can see, after routing it out, the bracket fits perfectly into the recess. To attach the bracket to the bench, I decided to use 1/4-20 bolts and tap the holes using the Wood Whisperer thread taps. I marked the hole location, used a punch to keep the bit from walking around, drilled a pilot hole, and then tapped the hole. The whole process is super quick, and the threads on a hole this deep are incredibly strong and should easily hold up to 2 people leaning back on the bench. One other quick note on the bench, the apron needs to be attached after the recess is cut into the bottom of the seat, otherwise you won't be able to get the router into that area. With the benches and table complete, I sanded everything up to 180 grit, and then sprayed 3 coats of General Finishes Endurovar, a water-based polyurethane, sanding between each coat. I love the way this stuff looks, and it is super quick to apply since it dries so fast. Once the finish was applied, the table and benches were done.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoy this one. I am really happy with the way this table turned out. This walnut is just gorgeous. This fits the space perfectly. The height is perfect to be able to see this gorgeous view, and I just love it. So again, I do have plans available. I'll have a link to those in the video description below if you're interested in building this for yourself. And while it is a pretty big build, it's actually not a terribly difficult build as long as you kind of break it down into more simple steps. And it does require a good bit of walnut though, so you will be spending a pretty penny on solid walnut, but really happy with the way it turned out. I also do have Crafted Workshop t-shirts available if you want to check those out. I'll have a link to those as well in the video description. Also in the video description, I have a list of all the tools and materials I use for this project, and I use affiliate links for those, so that really helps to support the channel. Thanks again to everybody for watching, and until next time, happy building.